around this time each year, I invite us to spend the Sunday reflecting on the Unitarian half of our UU heritage. The Unitarian and the Universalist movements of which we are part began centuries before any of us were born, and exploring the stories of our collective past can help explain parts of our present and inform parts of our future. And today is a particularly auspicious time to reflect on that Unitarian half of our history, because today is precisely the 200th anniversary of William Ellery Channing's influential sermon, Unitarian Christianity. I know you've all read it and memorized it, right? It was delivered only about 50 miles east of here at the first independent church of Baltimore, known today as First Unitarian. Have any of you been to First Baltimore? I see quite a few hands. Check it out if you get a chance. It's a beautiful historic congregation, huge cathedral ceiling, really a gorgeous space if you ever get a chance to see it. Channing's historic sermon on May 5th, 1819 helped catalyze a movement toward claiming the name Unitarian boldly and unapologetically. To better appreciate why this sermon matters both then and now, I'd like to invite us to zoom out and consider the larger historical context in which he was led to preach those words in the first place. I've given a previous sermon about Channing's life, so I don't want to do that again. It's in our sermon archive. So I'll focus instead on the ways that his sermon was a very direct response to a conflict that began a decade and a half earlier in 1805 when with a controversial professorial appointment at Harvard University, and it ended 30 years later in 1835. So Channing preached his most famous sermon in the middle phase of this larger controversy that really spanned a generation. And there are resonances from this controversy that continue to echo today. There are significant historical reasons that we UUs have inherited these sayings. Like, there's a reason we say we believe in deeds, not creeds, and we don't have to believe alike to love alike. Both of these slogans highlight our emphasis on ethics over dogma, that we are a big tent movement that doesn't require our members to subscribe to a particular set of theological doctrines. But the freedom we enjoy to prioritize right relationship over right belief, that was hard-won. I don't want us to miss that. In the decades before Channing's famous sermon, tension had been building for quite some time between congregational Christians who were more theologically orthodox and those who were more theologically liberal. The Orthodox group tended to stress the importance of authoritative doctrine. Some of you have heard me say this before. When you think of that word orthodox, you can think of like your orthodontist, right? Like orthodox. Ortho means straighten. Your orthodontist is orthodente, straightens your teeth, right? But orthodox, if you know the word doxology, like praise words, doxe, logos, that it means it straightens your praise. It tells you how to praise, how to believe rightly. So that's what the Orthodox are interested in. Some of you may have grown up in congregations whose Sunday service included reciting a doctrinal statement, like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. Anybody? All right. You know what I'm talking, preach, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? In Channing's context, the favored creed was neither of those. It's actually the Westminster Confession of 1646. Again, I'm sure you all know it well. It's on your bedside table. It detailed beliefs about the Bible, the Trinity, predestination, the meaning of Jesus' death, the right relationship between church and state, the end of time, and more. And the Orthodox thought that what really mattered was ensuring that everyone agreed to the Westminster Confession of 1646, not that bunk like the one of 1549, right? The right one. And whereas the belief of the liberals had a much greater tolerance for diversity of belief because their emphasis was on ethics and on right action, living a good life. That whole behavior is believable, right? I'm less interested in what you say you believe than what you actually do. I should also clarify that at the time, all of our Unitarian and Universalist forebears understood themselves as Christians, albeit often as theologically liberal Christians. At the time of Channing's sermon in 1819, we're still before the Transcendentalist controversy, where that began opening us up more to all the world's religions. We're before the challenge of Darwin's evolutionary science. We're before the humanist controversy that really influenced our movement in the early 20th century. Channing believed that the commonalities between the liberals and conservatives in his day before all of that they had no way of envisioning, that was more important than the differences. He was really hopeful that he could convince the Orthodox of that. He did not. But he was unable to assuage this growing fear among the Orthodox that the liberals' tolerance for diversity would lead them over time to become less recognizably Christian. And here's the thing. From our perspective, 200 years later, there are many ways in which the Orthodox fears were spot on. Although Christianity remains the fourth of our six sources, it is now one among many. It's not the one source as it was in Channing's day. I would add, not that there's anything wrong with that. But Channing really did think that Unitarianism would always be a Christian Unitarianism, significantly different than the pluralistic, multicultural Unitarian Universalism that we know today. In Channing's day, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back between this building tension between the Orthodox and the liberals came in 1805, a decade and a half before his historic sermon. Henry Ware, a theological liberal, was elected to be the Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard, which that went back decades before that, and he was the new one. And that tipped the balance at the seminary between the number of professors that were known to be theologically conservative and those that were known to be theologically liberal. And this fear, again, arose among the Orthodox that the seminary was going to be forming liberal ministers. They were correct. As a side note, at UU General Assembly each year, have any of you ever been to a Ware lecture or watched one or heard of one? Okay, so that Ware lectureship that's happened in every year since the early 20th century, that's named after the same family of Wares as Henry Ware, whose appointment launched the Unitarian controversy. The more you know, some of you may be like, I don't care, but the more you learn about this stuff, the more you start seeing these connections everywhere, and it shows, oh, that's why that's the case, why we have a Ware lecture. So phase one of this conflict between the Orthodox and the liberals, it spanned about a decade, from 1805 to 1815, and during this time, one of the common criticisms of the theological liberals was that you are Unitarians. That wasn't how they understood themselves at that time, but that was, what the Orthodox were obsessing on, is that you're rejecting the Trinity as false, as unbiblical, as non-essential. On the other hand, the liberals thought that this doctrinal emphasis, this fixation on right belief, was an exercise in missing the point, because they thought what's really important is, irrespective of what you believe, are you living a life modeled on the life of Jesus? And this is where Channing's sermon, Unitarian Christianity, comes into play. The middle phase of this controversy was 1815 to 1825, and Channing's 1819 sermon is right in the middle. He used his sermon to define theological liberalism on its own terms, rather than allow himself and his friends to be defined by the uncharitable characterizations of their opponents. And there's a whole other important episode that happened in 1818, the year right before Channing's sermon. It's called the Dedham Decision. Could quiz you on this. The MFC should have asked you, right? What's the Dedham Decision? It's a court case that led to huge property battles over whether the liberal or the Orthodox retained control over the various church buildings throughout New England. We've seen this have huge implications in Episcopalianism and Methodism in our own day. And if you go to New England today, there's all these small towns where sometimes the big church in the town square, sometimes that's Unitarian, sometimes it's something else, and you can kind of trace the history of who won the battles in the wake of the Dedham decision by that. So I will, however, restrain myself from going into much more detail. When I teach you history at Wesley Theological Seminary, I have a full 90-minute lecture with the scintillating title, American Unitarianism, Origins to 1850, Development and Early Controversies. So you just got a 5-minute taste of that, and I'll give you the rest. But because this is the 200th anniversary of Channing's Baltimore sermon, I want to shift now to focus on the text of that historic sermon. But again, I'll be able to only cover a few aspects of this, because Channing's sermon weighs in at more than 13,000 words. It took him approximately 90 minutes to preach, but it's not like anybody was trying to get home to watch Netflix. I mean, so As a point of comparison, my sermons are more like 2,000 words. His are like 13,000 words. My homiletics professor used to say, sermons should be about something sacred in about 20 minutes. Then again, Channing did have some idea of what he was doing. If he had preached the sermon on a Sunday morning in his home congregation, and of course he had preached many of these themes there, it would not have been that significant, his home congregation in Boston. The primary audience would have been primarily sympathetic listeners. Instead, he chose to preach it on a Wednesday in Baltimore on the occasion of the ordination of the new member of that new congregation. Those of you who attended my installation here as minister a few years ago, or who have attended similar events in the past, know that occasions such as ministerial ordinations or installations mean often that neighboring ministers are in attendance. So you remember this, procession of ministers that were coming down the aisle and filling in. You'll have another opportunity. Just this past week, we set the date of Sunday, June 30th at 4 p.m. for Megan's ordination. So that's coming up. But so Channing was ready for the controversy that he knew would ensue when he preached theological liberalism when Orthodox ministers were present. He had his sermon prepared for publication immediately afterwards. Everyone publish your sermon, right? Due to the high demand, it actually went into 5 editions within the first 6 weeks, and especially over the next century, many more editions were printed. It was read in England, in France, in Holland, in Germany, even in India and other countries. Unsurprisingly, many Orthodox colleagues hated it. They described Channing's words as a cup of poison, in fatal error, and as an entirely different religion from that which you believe. Again, notice that emphasis on belief. But many hearers and readers open to a more progressive theological view were deeply grateful for Channing's clear, reasoned articulation of what it might mean to be religious in the modern world. Now, I do think that Channing's sermon, all 13,000 plus words of it, are worth revisiting. There's a reason. You can Google it. It's free on the internet, well past copyright. There's a reason, even today, that one of the requirements to be a UU minister is to read this sermon, as well as a whole stack of other stuff. At the same time, I don't want to give the impression that Channing's sermon is without problems from a 21st century perspective. There's a huge amount of value, even as on the first page you see evidence of what we could frankly call his Christian supremacy. He thought of Christianity as the last and most perfect revelation. He was very clear about that. And although those parts of his sermon, and although there are parts of his sermon that don't hold up today, there are many other parts that were a critical contribution to what is known as the liberal turn in religion. Not the turn to the Democratic Party, but the turn toward liberalism in that classic sense, from the Latin root libere, meaning free, a reorientation toward freedom in religion, in contrast to saying, I believe something because of hierarchy, because the religious people tell me what to believe, or I believe something because of tradition, right? Because it's allegedly always been that way. The turn toward the liberal turn in religion is about believing something based on reason and experience as critical sources of authority. And in a world where theological orthodoxy was far more dominant than it is today, it is difficult to overemphasize how powerful it was to have a prominent minister such as Channing reassure you that it is okay to trust your reason. These things that you've always thought were illogical, they're illogical. It's what he was saying. It's okay. You don't just have to say, check your brain at the door of the church. To have a minister like Channing, trust your experience. If you know something to be true because you've experienced it firsthand for yourself, you can trust that. No, you don't have to disbelieve it because it's just out of hand because of what's allegedly always been the case. I should add that Channing's emphasis was much more on reason in religion. That's very clear from his sermon. The emphasis on experience came much more fully with the next generation of Emerson, of Thoreau, of Fuller, and those who led the Transcendentalist revolt within Unitarianism. Now, some of you who grew up theologically liberal, these ideas may not seem that radical, but I can remember being a college sophomore beginning to seriously question the theologically conservative beliefs that I'd been raised with. And from that perspective, Channing's 200 200-year-old words would have been as helpful to me in the late 1990s as they were originally to burgeoning liberals in the early 1800s. In my case, it was more, I didn't know about Channing's sermon then. In my case, it was more books like John Shelby Spong's Why Christianity Must Change or Die that hit me like a bolt of lightning. There may be other examples in your case. But I can equally imagine the power of Channing's words. Bishop Spong was writing in 1999. How much more important that Channing was writing 180 years earlier in 1819. Channing wrote, quote, "Our leading principle in interpreting Scripture is that the Bible is a book written for humanity, in the language of humanity, and that its meaning is to be sought in the same manner as any other book." That's incredible, just to say really baldly, read this with the same tools you read any other book. He affirmed that, quote, "the different portions of the Bible refer to the times when they were written, to feelings and usages which have passed away, and without the knowledge of which we are constantly in danger of extending to all times and all places what was of temporary and local application." Again, yes, that's so helpful to say this was helpful then, maybe it actually wasn't, but not now. He went on to detail logical contradictions in various places of Scripture. Right on, just be honest about that. Many people in his day read these passages and felt affirmed in what they had always suspected but maybe hadn't felt permission to say aloud. For the first time, many people felt permission to just free themselves from these constrictive theological dogmas that they had felt bound up in. Before I conclude, allow me as well to briefly tell you a little bit of the rest of the story about that larger Unitarian controversy that began in 1805 and of which Channing's 1819 sermon was a midpoint. Channing's bold words helped bring the theological liberals closer together, leading 6 years later to the organization of the American Unitarian Association in 1825, which then in 1960 voted to merge with the Universalists. But going back to the 19th century, a decade after, historians date the end of that Unitarian controversy to 1835, and here's why, and I actually find this piece really fascinating. The theological liberals had barely unified. It's often we unify in opposition to things, so they had barely unified, developing this clear identity in contrast to the Orthodox, when no sooner did they do that than they began to fight and fracture within themselves. It's what's called the circular firing squad, right? The key moment arrived in 1836 when the former Unitarian minister Ralph Waldo Emerson published his first book, Nature. That's what helped launch the Transcendentalist revolt within Unitarianism. Their cherished reason had led them in too many cases to become, in Emerson's words, corpse cold. But that is the story for another day. Fast forwarding to our own time, I'll share a final historical resonance. Today, the brilliant scholar of religion, Dr. Karen King, is the new Hollis Chair of Divinity at Harvard University. She was the first woman appointed to that position, a chair that's been in existence since 1721, the oldest endowed chair in the United States. And that's the same named chair that Henry Ware was appointed to in 1805 that launched the Unitarian controversy in the first place. Some of you may know the name Harvey Cox. He wrote a famous book called Religion in the Secular City. He was the former holder of the Hollis Chair before Karen King. Here too, part of me wants to confess the Orthodox were not wrong to be worried. Today, Dr. Karen King, along with the rest of the faculty at Harvard Divinity School, they're stirring up theological liberalism exactly the way that the Orthodox feared that they would. But again, I would add, good for her, and not that there's anything wrong with that. And as ever, the question ultimately turns back to each of us, as Channing did in his own day, as Karen King and others are doing today. How do you feel led to speak out? How do you feel led to act to help build the world that we dream about? As we sing, I invite you to imagine Channing at his desk, writing his Baltimore sermon. You're trying to think, what are the words I need to say? What do I need to speak within my sphere of influence to make a difference? Keep that in mind. Ask that question yourself as we rise and sing together hymn 34.